post this post. Boop. All right, we can wait for people to start filtering in.
All right.
We should time .is while we wait.
Yeah, let's do it.
You got to real quick on the link if you want to catch
If you want to catch the clap. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't even have time .is up for people to see. Too many Uber Eats ads on here today, so.
There's lots of Uber Eats ads. Are we running Uber Eats ads now?
Time is 3 of them.
Oh, shit, really?
On my screen.
I don't.
4
Uber
of them.
Eats, if you hate restaurants and employees.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let's
use Uber Eats.
25?
Use the promo code friends at the table.
Nope, don't.
Nope.
25.
To...
25.
All right, but I had more jokes.
I bet. Uber Eats don't have any more money for us, so.
Yeah, where did all their money go? Was it just that they didn't have any in the first place?
It's like a whole fucking thing. It's a whole thing with there were two. It's a whole thing because there's kind of like two major, I want to say European investment firms that were like that are tied to a couple of major U.S. endeavors. WeWork and Uber, and SoftBank. SoftBank is like, I think they've hit the point where they're like, we're not going to give you more money until your money is good, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. That makes sense. I had no idea that WeWork and Uber Eats were the same, were
right.
You know, drinking from the same well.
Yeah, yes. I think the WeWork situation is much worse.
Yes, that stuff is just
or
in
terms of it being on fire, not in terms of it being a good business.
Now Uber Eats, those are some real stand-up folks compared to WeWork.
Jesus, this whole it's all fucked. All right,
doing there, Austin?
I'm fine. We should do a podcast or whatever this is. What is this live stream? It's also a podcast, right?
Oh yeah,
eventually.
Yeah,
eventually.
Welcome to Tips at the Table, an RPG podcast focused on critical questions, hopefully smart answers, and fun interaction between good friends. I'm your host, Austin Walker. Joining me today, Art Martinez-Tebble.
Hey, hi. You can find me on Twitter at @atebble. And I've been listening to a podcast this week sponsored by a different podcast that's just branded WeWork content. And it's from like over the summer. So it's really surreal now because I bet like they're not sponsoring podcasts anymore.
I bet not. Also joining us, Jack DeKeat.
Hi, my name's Jack. You can find me on Twitter at NotQuiteReal or buy any of the music featured on the show at notquitereal.bandcamp.com. The Bluff City premiere theme went up this afternoon, so you can get it there.
That is exciting. It's a great song. Also joining us, Janine Hawkins.
Hey, I'm Janine Hawkins. I'm at Bleating Heart on Twitter. I've been playing The Sims Realm of Magic all month. Sure. And Thursday's the last day that I'm doing it, so maybe I should have mentioned it sooner.
I don't know. When would you have, though? I don't know that we did. Were you on a previous tip? You probably should.
I don't know. It doesn't matter.
At some point, yeah.
That's on my YouTube.
You know what would have been fucking sick?
Bleeding Heart on YouTube, yeah?
Is if either of your super mystical characters from the previously released Road to Season 6 games would have broken the fourth wall like the witches they were, spoken to the listener and said, go to youtube.com/bleedingheart for a Sims Magic live stream. Yeah, exactly.
I just realized I do have like a weird sort of ram-headed ghost thing, so it kind of happened the other way, sort of.
For people who haven't been, people should go listen to the Road to Partisan stuff that's in the main feed. I would say definitely do it if you're caught up on Counterweight and Twilight Mirage. This is the most for true fans only stuff that we've done, true gamers only, because it's filled with cool references to the stuff from Twilight Mirage and from Counterweight. It is very much the bridge between those series and the upcoming Partisan. I'm not saying you couldn't listen to it without listening to those other ones first, but I don't know that you get as much from it. this week has one of my favorite episodes we did during that live stream series, which is the game of Echo and From Dusk Till Midnight. Two fantastic little games that we played. We played a full Echo game. We played like half of a From Dusk Till Midnight game. And some of my favorite characters that we've ever played on into a microphone. So look forward to that. We should get into the tips of the table questions. As always, if you have questions, you can send them to tips@thetable@gmail.com. First one comes in from Jay, who says, I've been playing in a game of the Sprawl for about 2.5 years now. We've all enjoyed this game very much. However, a recent plot revelation has kind of ruined the entire game for a lot of our group. Specifically, it was revealed that the entire cyberpunk city that we live in is just an elaborate computer simulation. We, the players, and a small group of 3 or so NPCs are the only real people in the entire city. That could be good plot development, but that's not really the story we as players have been interested in telling up to this point. For us, this is a game very much about making a place for oneself in the middle of an uncaring system. We've all worked very hard to make a place that is our own in this city. For example, I'm playing a fixer, and now the dozens of names I've added to my contacts list over the years are just gone. They've never mattered. As is my character's mechanical relevance, all of my skills are about finding people who no longer exist. All of us players have been really disappointed by this turn of events. How do I either speak to our GM about this issue or learn to enjoy this game again now that it's something so different than what I signed up for? I'm going to start with Jack and Janine here because both of you had such strong reactions to this.
We have pretty strong responses to this. Yeah. I found this question to be really upsetting. In terms of what is being described, sounds like such a blow to have to experience as a player, especially because of the way that Jay describes it as kind of ruining the game for a lot of the group, especially since they've been enjoying it so much. There's a very kind of distinct feeling. And I remember this from playing games on the playground when I was a kid and playing tabletop games in other groups where a game takes a turn and the joy or the excitement of playing is kind of sapped out of it very easily feeling. It's as though a transformation has occurred and it's not the thing you thought you were playing. And I think for that reason, I found this question really upsetting. I think that learning to enjoy the game is a big ask, and it might be something that you feel like you need to do in order to kind of maintain sort of the sanctity of the table. But I really think that something like this is worth talking to other players and talking to your GM about, because what it represents to me is a kind of failure of understanding or failure of communication by your GM about what the story that you're interested in telling is. I don't know if that seems accurate to others, but it feels like there has been a big mistake here made by the GM.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that it is worth addressing rather than saying, well, I hope the game kind of gets better again.
Yeah, no, I think that it is so important at this point to have that conversation. Janine, before I weigh in, again, you definitely had a similar reaction. I don't know if you have anything else to add here.
Yeah, I think I second everything Jack said, but also the thing I want to follow up with is it's hard to know because we don't have the full context here, but who's saying that the characters don't matter now?
Right. Yeah.
Totally. is because the whole everything is a simulation and we're the only real people, so nothing matters. Does nothing matter because you've been removed from that simulation? The simulation's been shut down. Does nothing matter because you've been given ways to interact with the simulation outside of the framework you've been using before? Does nothing matter because, the most obvious comparison here is the Matrix, but the thing with the storytelling in the Matrix is once Neo unplugs from the Matrix, he keeps going back in and keeps interacting with it, and it's not a thing where once he's unplugged, he's just out forever. So if that's the story that's being told, then yeah, I fucking get it. Nothing you've done matters. Like it must feel really shitty because everything that you have been building, you are just kind of back at square one in a sense. And have built your character around, you're back at square one. But if you are still interacting with that simulation, like who's deciding that those things don't matter? Because like we've had on our show,
Yeah.
we've had situations where we've had meaningful interactions with characters who are not real and do not matter,
Or
technically.
who by the laws of society or the kind of laws of traditional fiction, you'd be like, oh, well, that's not a real person. That's a
Yes.
robot or an automaton or a projection or,
I
an
think
illusion
of
or
Signet with that like summoned blooming. I think it was
right.
blooming,
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
yeah.
Totally. That's a fantastic
Um,
moment. Yeah.
where like Signet treated that apparition like they didn't matter
Hmm.
because she was very much in her head of just like she knew what she had done to will this thing into being and whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, by the end of that interaction, it was like, no, this is different. Like this isn't just an idea made sort of semi-flesh. Like there's more to this. So it's, I guess, if you feel like you've had all of that stuff pulled away from you, I'm curious, again, it's one of those things just like, is there a way to reframe it? Is there a way to, again, like you should totally talk to the GM about like, does this stuff, like where do these abilities that you have, where do these connections that you've made, where does this story and this world that you've grown attached to fit in the context of like, well, now it's all fake,
Right. I'm so
quote
curious
unquote
about
fake.
the context because the world, there's a version of this where it's like that world still exists and you as the character and the player go, and those people are still important to me. And I don't care that they are an algorithm; they are people. And you insist, and talk to your GM, and then you insist, like, hey, my character is deciding to continue to care for those people and to continue to make a world for them or a space for them. But if the world is like, and the simulation is off now, and you actually live in a post-apocalypse, and there's no way to get back to those people, then that is such a more dire situation that feels like we said at the jump, a big misreading from the GM about what y'all were interested in, and that to me is why it's so important to have that conversation with the GM, is because if you don't get good practices in place, there's a good chance that a similar mistake might happen in the future. A similar, disconnect between what you as the players are interested in and what they as the GM are interested in, without a moment of conversation around it. In the chat here now, someone had said, Bilby in the chat said, I get the GM's position as a GM. Pulling a great twist is so satisfying when it hits, but games are group matter, etc. And I definitely, we have had some big changes in every season we've done, or I guess especially Counterweight and Twilight Mirage, and especially Twilight Mirage, where we went, okay, the second half of this season is going to feel substantially different. But the process of doing that was not a surprise. The process of that switch was like me having an idea, me bringing the production team on board as stakeholders, then I say I'm revealing something about my history in media here, which is anytime someone outside makes a decision about a thing without the stakeholders being involved in that decision, people are going to be pissed. And so, yeah, like I think you look at the Twilight Mirage stuff, I came to everyone eventually, and I was like, not even eventually, well before we did the mid-season finale of that game, and I said, hey, I have this idea. I think I want to switch systems. I think I want to do that along with changing the game and like the genre a little bit and go from being really introspective and kind of more slowly paced and much more metaphysical and like high concept to something a little more, grimy, Star Wars, Destiny, more actiony, more focused on kind of smaller story bites than big ideas. And that conversation happened. And then when it happened in the game, everyone was at least prepared for it, at least interested in like, how can we make this my best version of that thing? And I guess if you're a GM and listening, my advice to you is if you have one of these big ideas, do not value the joy you have of like, aha, you've activated my fucking trap card, more than the joy that comes from collaborating with your friends on a story. Like, be excited to bring them in at the moment that you have the idea. And I know that that's anxiety inducing because you have to pitch them an idea, and there's a chance that they'll be like, no, we're really just interested in continuing the Cyberpunk game that we've done. But having that conversation is the best way that you can ensure the joy of everyone at the table and the comfort of everyone at the table. Because now you've put your players. I know this is not the you in question probably isn't listening to this, but the generic GM who has a big twist idea. If you're going to do something that so firmly dismisses or ignores the investment that your players have made in who their characters are, both fictionally and mechanically, you have to bring them in, and it should be. It is not only part of your responsibility as the GM, but it is something where you should cultivate a table presence that makes that part of the enjoyment for you, is coming to the conclusion of what that thing looks like, instead of it just being on your shoulders. Art, it sounded like you had something else also.
Art just reappeared.
Oh, did Art lose connection?
I did. Am
Well,
I back?
Yes, tentatively. Kind of. It sounded like you had something, though.
Well, I think that might have been the sound of me disconnecting. And of course, I missed anything that was said while I was gone. So if I'm just repeating something that's already been said, just interrupt me at any time.
Okay.
But one of my favorite Simpsons moments is when there's that big hole. Anyone know what I'm talking? They're digging for a treasure that isn't really there, and they find like the box being like, "We've tricked you. There's no treasure," and they say that like they're gonna keep digging, and then they cut to like much later, and there's a really big hole, and they realize they've been tricked, and then Chief Wiggum says to, I think, Otto, who's digging, "No, dig up, stupid," because they're trying to dig out of this giant hole now. And I think that like you have to remember that you can, in this situation, you can definitely dig up. You can fix this by going through, not by necessarily being out, not by like rewinding. And I think that there might be some good gameplay and like finding out that the things about this were false.
Yeah.
It's so dangerous though, and like twists deployed incautiously can be so dangerous for this reason, where like even if the GM is like, no, that wasn't real, they are all real people, the bubble has been broken, like a Rubicon has been crossed. And I think this is why Art saying go through rather than rewind. I mean, I'm trying to think about how I would feel if the GM was just like, no, actually I didn't mean that, they are real. Don't worry about it.
Well, I guess for me it's like if I did a thing and everyone was unhappy with it, I would, and like we had to talk about it, I wouldn't mind being like, let's throw it out. You know what? Like, it's not that important. Like
it would have happened.
Like, but it didn't.
There's
because
no way it won't shape the.
Of course,
no way
of course. It will shape the play and the feel of it, and it will sting for the first like 3 sessions. And I bet 7 sessions in, when this person has shaped the campaign towards like what the player flags are, and they've developed new things, and they've come to a new understanding of trust. Like, I don't think, and maybe this is like betraying the role of the GM for me, or like betraying canon or the whatever. I don't give a fuck. Like, I don't care about what we already said. If we could say something better instead, delete it. Like, games are weird because they're not like fiction. You're right. Like, the words were already said. You're always playing forward. But in the same way that if we're playing a card game and you make a misplay and you go, oh, can I take that back? And I'll go, yeah, of course. Like, we're not playing competitively in this moment. I want to open up that possibility space for collaborative storytelling. Like, it's the same thing. I'm working on this comic right now, right, with Evan, and you've no idea how many times you go like, wait a second, that thing that we said in plot in beat 1 doesn't work anymore. Like, we have to go change that, even though we made the decision and we were firm about it 3 weeks ago. And I wish the table presence could be more like that for RPGs and less like the like hard and fast rules of chess. And that doesn't mean that for me, like, I think that I can draw the line between you didn't take damage and you didn't die 3 weeks ago from this, which is such a mismatch between player interest and fictional outcomes. I think there's a big difference between that and like, oh, you know what? Don't worry about it. You didn't take damage. If that makes sense. Like, I think you can retain the quote unquote sanctity of gameplay rules without necessarily feeling like you're stuck in whatever decision happened especially last session. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's obviously it is up to the players. I get the argument that you're saying. I get the point of like, it did happen.
I'm not talking about sanctity so much. I'm not talking about the like we have to play by the rules. I think I feel similarly to you in the sense that like we really don't. Like if this is something we feel uncomfortable about, I think the position I'm coming at it from is that as a player, and like what we're talking about is like a radical redefinition of our characters' relationships to the world, done kind of without consultation or conversation with us. I would feel like there had been a breach of trust.
Oh, absolutely.
That would be much harder to regain than a few sessions, I think.
But at that point, I don't think digging through works either. Like at that point, I don't know that like sticking. If I was the player in that scenario, sticking with that GM who was like, well, I'm not going to undo it.
Yeah.
But if you care about it, I guess I'll start letting you back in the simulation. Like,
this is where a bigger conversation needs to be had.
Exactly. Right. Well, and the conversation has to also be between the players in terms of what they do want. Because if the bulk of the table is like, well, let's make the best of what already happened, then yeah, that is what they should do. But I wouldn't want someone thinking that that's the most they could ask for. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
I think it should be in the conversation at least to say, hey, let's throw out the end of that session because it didn't happen. It isn't real. And that, again, is something that the table can arrive at, even if it makes, I mean, again, it's like whose comfort matters most here. And I definitely understand the idea of like, I don't know, like for me, it would be really hard to continue this game, at all. And I think Art can attest to have been in games like this with me in college where the GM was more interested in telling their story than in following what the players wanted. And it's just like, at some point, you have to either be willing to like take that leap of faith and trust, and say what you want, because that is part of that leap of faith, right? Is like, it isn't just. I think again in college, the thing I would have done would have been not said anything. Said something quietly under my breath to my friends who were also in the game about how I was bummed about how the game was going, but then tried to like make the best of it, and that's the worst possible solution. I think the best possible solution is everything that everyone has said already, which is like have that conversation with the GM. But part of, I think, the leap of faith and trust is like, if you think that that's a repairable relationship, you should not feel like beholden to what has already happened if the rest of the table is similarly interested in just like hitting the rewind button. But again, different tables and different priorities. I would not be mad if this person wrote back and I was like, hey, we talked about it. We figured out a way to go forward where, it's true. But also, like, again, it's definitely what works for y'all.
I think it's also worth underscoring here that, like, a big part of reading players and sort of figuring out what their flags are and sort of moving stories in directions that appeal to everyone is looking at their moves, because the moves that people take are a really good indication of both what they think is necessary for the story you're telling, which is a good way to see if everyone thinks they're telling the same kind of story.
Yeah.
But also to see where people want their character to go. So if you have a player who is taking a bunch of moves that are about interacting with characters, and then your play is all these characters are computer programs or whatever, you need to have you need to have another play after that will help them not feel like they wasted all their moves, as Jay does.
Yeah, totally.
Or like that they even wasted their entire character arc, like, which Jay clearly feels like is the case.
I definitely think like, God, it's so fucked up because I feel like there's a way in which this GM could have sold them on it. You know what I mean? Could have brought them in where it's like, hey.
Part of me wonders if it was like, if that was, again, this is why I look at this question. I'm so curious about the context, because this almost feels like I could so clearly imagine someone being like, this is their end of session twist, just like, and then the world flickers
Uh-huh.
and it turns off, and you're in a room, and it's a server room. This is me. I don't fucking know.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying. Yeah.
But it's so easy to imagine, like, that's the end of the session, and the person goes home, or like they go and they talk to their friends a little bit, and then they send this email in, and because
Yeah.
we don't know where it goes. Like, maybe
Yeah.
they do have something in mind. Maybe it does go somewhere.
I'm sure they have something in mind. You know, as the reading this, I'm like, oh, and then they're going to get filtered into a whole new social situation where the fixer builds, you know, creates new relationships with new NPCs. But again, you have to prime your players for that sort of big switch, right? Like, again, I think about the Twilight Mirage stuff, where it was like, I think Art, your character was going towards both Art and Janine, both of your characters were going towards like more social roles. From
Art's gone again.
Art's gone again. Okay, good. Art's okay. Well, Art's back just in time, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I certainly can hear people now.
I can hear you too.
Great. That's what we want here.
I was saying that, you know, when we did the big Twilight Mirage switch, we definitely, your character specifically became a person who knew people, and it was like, well, you're going to have to know all new people. You're going to have to, it's going to be all about, like, creating new relationships going forward. So it's not out of the question that the Fixer's moveset here could continue to be relevant, but though the Rolodex certainly would not be, right? Like, the established group of people would be limited, even in the sort of, like, compatibilist version where they both go in the system and stay out a little bit. Or whatever. But yeah, I think we're really all talking around, like, the biggest thing is, for me, it's like, why did the GM want to leave? What is the thing that the GM was like, let's change. No, this is fake. This is all fake. Why do they think it's fake with the capital F? This stuff doesn't matter. How is that signaled? And then importantly, just like, what is it about? Was that supposed to be like the end of a season? Was that supposed to be the end of like a... What made the GM want to make that move, and how do you rectify that against what sounds like the group of players who are like, no, we're into it. It's 2.5 years, you know.
Yeah, 2.5 years might be like him trying to quit, you know.
Yeah, but at that point, just say like, hey, let's wrap it up. Like, I know that's tough, but it can be really, you know, us. Like, I like to end games. I like to end stories, and I think you have so much more fun being like, hey, I think I want to wrap this up. I think my tenure as GM is wrapping up. Maybe someone else can pick it up. Or we could have like a really cool finale. Though I think also the finale of like, and none of it was real would fucking suck. So
yeah, this is like the GM equivalent of ghosting. It's like, instead of just not answering calls, it's like, well, no one was real. Bye.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's keep moving. Good luck on this, Jay. Like, seriously, I hope that this turns around. Let us know. Please talk to your GM. If the GM is listening, please talk to your players. If you're a GM who has a big twist planned and it's like this big, please look at your character sheets and be like, wait a second. Uh-oh. This is not what they want. Let me talk to them about it. This comes in from Nick, who writes, I love how the 2 consulting detective games and Hyron turned out, and I'm planning on running a murder mystery in a Forge in the Dark system soon myself, but I'm a little worried at how easily mystery stories can fall apart or become frustrating for players if they misinterpret or just miss evidence and clues. Do you have any tips for running a mystery that's satisfying for players? I have like a handful of tips here that I hope are helpful for you. And they're not necessarily things that were exactly true for the consulting detective games, but are at least, especially in the Rosemary one, and then more generally when we've done mystery stuff since then, basically true, which is you don't need, the game doesn't exist. There is not a particular piece of evidence in a particular room. There are pieces of evidence you need them to find, and connections that exist between people and their motives. But you can produce evidence wherever you need that evidence to show up. And so what I've always done is kind of had like priority number 1, they need to find this evidence. And I put that in a number of places. If there is like a map where they're exploring a map, I put that style of, hey, here are the key players in this mystery, in a number of places where they're most likely to go to, or even where they will necessarily go to because it's a choke point, because it's a place they have to pass through, because it's an NPC that is, I know because of the way I sell the NPC, they will want to talk to that NPC. I spend extra time on that stuff. And, obviously some of it gets wasted anyway, but along the way, what you do is you go like, all right, here's one piece of evidence, and this is super important, and so that can show up in 10 places, or that can show up, I'll keep that on a sideboard so that whenever they succeed at a roll, if they haven't gotten it yet, I can call this and pull this in. Because you're not actually creating an actual crime scene. What you're creating is a sort of crime logic that's unfolding. The second thing is that you don't need to know what happened. What you believe happened can change. Not to the degree that it undercuts what they've already discovered, but the opposite, which is if they find solutions that you think are more interesting than what you've already written down, if they find connections, as long as it doesn't invalidate something else that has been established, you should feel free to let them run with that. And barring it being a more interesting thing where like you give them the alternate read or the alternate dilemma and force them to choose, it is okay for them to have solved it in a way different than what you suspected, if that's the tone of the game, especially, right? I think the Rosemarrow detective and the Rosemarrow detective story versus the Velis detective story are so distinct in this way, where the Velis story had a very clear bad actor that was lined up to be discovered and someone that they were manipulating. The Rosemarrow thing was like, even when you figure this out, it will be impossible or it will be very hard to deliver justice on the person who is actually responsible for this. And that was intentional and meant to, actually communicate something about the state of the world. And those like if your game is interested mostly in, I want to give my players the experience of discovery and of mystery solving, you should feel comfortable making the decisions that betray your prep in favor of supporting the decisions that they make. Misinterpretations are allowed to be interpretations, and it does take some quick thinking or multiple sessions and rewriting to do that. But like, trust your ability to do that and give yourself the time to do that. I'm curious from player side, is there anything here from the frustration side that could be useful to call out in terms of making that stuff clear? I don't think that Nick is actually like doing the consulting detective thing. So stuff about like movement points is probably not that important, but more generally in terms of like mystery storytelling stuff.
The thing I'll say, and this might be a little controversial, the best tabletop crime kind of exploring, intriguey stories that I've experienced have happened in the quiet year.
Sure. Yeah.
The ones that are most memorable to me, they are always the simplest and shortest, and like they are a small part of other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But every time I've played the quiet year, basically there has been something like that. And I remember those so much more clearly and often a lot more fondly than I remember the more complicated crime story things, because I think because it forces that degree of adaptability that that you were sort of talking about of like, there isn't a set answer in that case. It is very much just like you find your way to the answer by random happenstance, whether you're actively pursuing it or not in a lot of cases. Like the answer kind of almost finds you based on the cards that get drawn and whatnot. And I find that a lot more interesting, a lot more satisfying, and a lot less frustrating.
Yeah.
In general, just because it doesn't feel like everything hinges on me getting a perfect 10 in every fucking way. Like it feels like it doesn't rely on me really catching everything that's thrown my way. Because that's a kind of pressure that some people really respond well to, but I can find that very frustrating.
Yeah, fair. I definitely think on that note too, if you're playing this with a Forge in the Dark system, do not rely on your primary evidence to only show up for dice rolls. If you go listen to the Rosemarrow game, obviously we were playing Dungeon World and not Forge in the Dark game, but there were things that people got just by going to a place. They got extra stuff if they rolled well, but what you have to allow for is that they walk into the room and fail every roll, and that if it's minor information there, maybe they don't get some color, but like for the mystery not to fall apart, it should not be tied to a successful. Like it's also just not how Powered by the Apocalypse games work. In the same way that, like, if you come to a door and it's locked and there's no stress and you're a thief and there's no risk, there's no like exterior risk, let the thief open the fucking door. In the same way, if you're like being admitted to a crime scene and you're here to study the crime scene, and you're like detectives or you're competent at examining a crime scene and there's no like immediate threat, give them stuff. And let them ask questions, and then if they want extra stuff that maybe they don't have questions for, let them roll. But don't necessarily hide all that stuff behind dice rolls, because you just don't know. You might get the worst possible outcome of just like failure, and that can be tough.
The worst feeling would be like getting to the end of the mystery and like realizing you don't have the shit you need to like to solve it, like you don't have the right answer, and then the GM is just like, well, you should have asked if there were any footprints in the snow outside the bar.
Yeah, fuck off.
Like the equivalent of like pixel hunting, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
no, that is the worst.
That is the worst. Were you ever in any Call of Cthulhu games with me, Art?
Yeah,
because those were always that. 100% that style of thing.
It's just like, but you didn't look under the desk, and it's like, come on.
Well, yeah, Call of Cthulhu lends itself to bad stuff like that. Like if you don't have a point in driving, you don't know how to drive.
Oh my god, what a fucking disaster game! I love that GM. That GM is a good friend of mine. Shout outs to Anthony. Yes,
he didn't write that game.
No, exactly. He did love it and want to run it all the time, though. So, Matthias in the chat notes that gather information rolls in Blades in the Dark and Forged in the Dark games, a 1 to 3 is still adequate. It's never if you do gather information and get a 1 to 3 in Forged in the Dark, it's never nothing. It's always at least something. And so, yeah, that actually does make this maybe a little bit easier. I'm gonna keep moving. This comes in from Riley, who says, for the past couple of months, I've been working on a game inspired by the TV show Black Sails. It's a show about the golden age of piracy, focused on the interpersonal relationships and motivations of an ensemble cast, as well as how they interact with larger forces that rule their lives. It's a very good show, and I highly recommend it, by the way. Anyways, after we need a check from the Black Sails Company. All right, great. So I'm going to write down the Black Sails Company as a great name for a Season 6 faction. Anyways, after a million different iterations of the mechanics of the game, I finally settled on a quasi-belonging outside belonging hack, which focuses on how characters feel about each other's actions. I'm pretty confident about the base mechanic now, but that means I've reached the point where I have to start thinking about character creation stuff. I like the idea of there being playbooks somewhat in the belonging outside belonging style, but I have trouble figuring out how to figure out archetypes on which to base playbooks like that. So my question is, when you're playing games, what interests you about the playbooks in them? I know you haven't played a ton of belonging outside belonging games, though I would love to hear a continuation of that Dream Askew game from 1,000 years ago. And Forged in the Dark / Powered by the Apocalypse games aren't exactly the same, but what about those playbooks helps to inform who your character is, especially with regard to their goals / motivations, the way they see the world, and their interpersonal relationships? How would you make playbooks / playbook moves different and interesting in a setting where there isn't necessarily any magic or sci-fi? I'm going to leave this all up to y'all, since you're the players who pick playbooks and have literally been going through this with Partisan in the last couple months.
I feel so unqualified to answer this question because, like, I've done for this thing of ours, I've done like one character completely defined by a playbook, which I picked because I didn't get the 2 playbooks I wanted to get going into the first session.
Wait, which is that?
Oh, I went into the first Hyron game being like, I want to be the wizard or the fighter, but I'm not going to pick. I want to pick last.
Wow. You know what? That was a very Hadrian thing of you to do. So
yeah, it turns out that you accidentally found Hadrian straight away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then the other ones have just been like, well, I'm going to do a thing, and then we're just going to make something fit. Like, especially because like in Counterweight we sort of got playbooks later, and in
Right. Yeah.
Twilight Mirage it was just like I had like this idea. I was like, well, I'm gonna wedge this into whatever
The closest
playbook I need to both
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
And for Partisan, I don't want to like give too much of that away right now. I kind of did the same. I had a full on idea, and I was like, well, what works with this?
Which
So
what were you looking when you say though when you're like, well, what fits in that scenario? What is it that you ended up resonating from those various playbooks in terms of like, yeah, this connects? Is that about just like having moves that line up with sequences you want to play? Does it line up with like character traits that you hope to embody? Stuff like that?
I think it's often like little things. Like I knew I wanted to be whatever the hell Grand Magnificent started out as. When I saw that you could make something that causes humanity harm, I was like, I am doing that. That is what I want. I want to make a mech so beautiful that it hurts your ability to be a human.
Yeah, well, that happens.
And yeah, and it went great.
Mm-hmm.
And then I mean for Partisan it was I mean you pitched the playbook to me for Partisan. I was like, yeah, that works.
Well, it's funny because in Partisan, which we're not going to say playbooks yet. I mean, if you don't want to say playbooks, I'm not going to stop you. But it was very much a situation. And in fact, Janine, when we get to you, maybe we have to have a talk about whether or not you want to say it because there was definitely an interesting story for yours. But Art, like, we actually thought you were going to do a different thing because we were tied to one particular move that was about a thing your character could do. We're like, oh, we have this idea in your head of like, you want to be a character who can do blank. And like, well, this move on this playbook lets you do blank. But then later I'd seen some other stuff and I was like, oh, actually, based on what you've told me about your character, maybe this is more you. And we'll see how it goes, right? This is the funny thing. It's like, well, I don't fucking know how it's going to go.
Well, we're still planning to do that first thing. It's just like I have to come up with narrative reasons not to do it until I get the move.
Until you get the move, yeah. Or yeah. I have some thoughts on this too. We'll talk after this call about that. But yes,
sure, yeah.
Jack and Janine.
I think I'm very similar to Art in this regard, in that like I have a very nebulous sense of the character before I think about the playbook. It definitely goes that way around. Although I think if we were like all in the same room and we were sitting around a table opening a new tabletop game for the first time, I would be much more ready to pick a playbook, from scratch rather than going into it with a character. I'd be like, oh, you know what? Okay, I'll play a wizard this time, or like let's see how that's going to feel. But definitely when we're making the show, I am like, here are the questions I'm interested in asking, and here are the scenes I'm just like so broadly interested in seeing. What in these playbooks appeals to me? And I think, like Art's talking about, it's very frequently a move, or in the case of Forged in the Dark games, talking about equipment and items and things, where if I have a picture of the character in my head and I'm like, what's in their bag? And then I look at the playbooks and I go like, oh, right, it looks like it's more like this or it's more like that. And then there's always a fun process where you find that, like, the fact that the Hitchcocks can't prowl was not done on purpose, but as soon as like we saw that in the character sheet, it became funnier and funnier. And so there's an aspect to which once I know roughly the type of character I play, and that leads me to a playbook, I will definitely be like, oh, now the playbook is going to start informing what this character is like in like a slightly different way.
Yeah, totally. I think that the Hitchcocks were also interesting. Well, the most interesting thing for me was when we switched to Scum and Villainy, and you're like, oh, I love this move, and it was about no one being able to lie to you.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, Jack, this is the same playbook between the Hitchcocks and 1415.
And 14, yeah.
But you ended up playing them both so differently, which is so interesting to me. I mean, obviously, so differently. And they're not the same playbook, obviously. Scum and Villainy is a different game than Blades in the Dark, but there's some overlap with moves and kind of archetypes. And it was so fascinating to me that that move stuck out to you both times without it being, but for completely different reasons. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. With like Hitchcock, it's like I want to be able to tell when someone is lying to me because I'm like a sneaky bastard who's like, and like it's the like sparkling Disney like male lead who is just like, no, I do not believe this is true, and like tumbles further and further into problems. And with 14, it was like a character who is like desperately trying to like grasp onto any which way the Twilight Mirage is moving and sort of trying to like guide it or help it out. And so being like, you'll be able to tell when someone is lying to you there was so much more pragmatic than Hitchcock's like, it'll be really cool if I can spot a lie.
Yeah. Yeah. Which again, I think does underscore the fact that like you were looking for something that connected to your goals and motivations.
Spoke to the character.
Yeah, totally. Janine, I'm curious for you because I feel like some of your choices have been so like bold in terms of what those characters are, especially with like Signet's initial playbook was like so important in delimiting who Signet was. But even more generally, I'm curious because we've had lots of talks around the like attractiveness of moves and stuff like that.
I honestly think I've been thinking about it, and like I think I'm kind of the same as Art and Jack here, where like playbooks are kind of the last thing I think about when I'm putting a character together. Like sometimes I always walk into it with a sort of concept of like I want to play a fancy space pope lady with a with like a crown and a bunch of mummified hands that don't come up ever.
Mm-hmm. If there had been a mummified hand move, then we would have probably come up.
I would have taken it. And like, I will always enter into it with that sort of basic idea, and then I try and find the playbook or the class or the whatever that fits that idea the best, or fits the idea of what I think that character does in the world and how they interact with it and how they behave the best. And of course, from there, like that playbook will then affect how that character develops further. Like because of course the onomastic playbook had a huge impact on Signet, and like the Veil really makes the class, at least in the onomastic's case, the class felt very integral to that character. It didn't feel as like I often think that like Adair could be a lot of different classes. I don't think there's that much about her that feels rooted in the thief. But to me, Signet is
1 second, stabbing motherfuckers in the back for a ton of damage.
Yeah, but that's kind of like that was like a late kind of a late game twist. Like Adair was never supposed to be good at fighting. It just kind of like happened.
It did kind of just happen. I know. I get what you're saying. I do get that. But I do think that ends up, that's like one of those things where it's like sometimes you find the character, an important part of the character from the playbook that is not necessarily like, hey, you would never sit down and be like, and also a thing about Adair is that she will consistently stab people in the back for a ton of damage. But that ends up being true about the character regardless of your like pre-written notion. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I pretty much, the only reason I picked Thief was because like I hadn't looked at any fan classes and basically all the other ones were taken. So I went into it being like, I want to play this map making former patent medicine seller, and I guess that's a thief. That's fundamentally, I guess, kind of a thief-like thing to be. But it's and with Partisan too, like there was, I think the thing you were alluding to was like you came to me with a playbook, like I think this is what your character is, and I was like, no,
well,
that's not.
I think it was actually the other way, right? Because the thing is that we had actually spent. We didn't know we were going to play Beam Saber until a couple of months ago, and for me, one of the big things was that like the party that played Beam Saber in the Beam Saber live game that will be in the main feed in a few weeks, or in a couple of weeks, I guess now, really loved it. But the other half of the party or the other half of the crew hadn't played Beam Saber yet. And it was like a thing where it was like, well, do we want to run another game in the road to season 6 where we play Beam Saber? That had been on the table in terms of potentially doing that after For the Queen instead of Microscope. But we had been running those games for so long. I wanted to get back to other live at the table games, and we needed to start prepping for Partisan, a game that did not have a name yet at that time, as people who are pusher level backers and have read the long journey of getting a name together know. At a certain point, I just reached out to everyone and was like, hey, like, I think it's Beam Saber. I like Armor Stir, but I'm like, it's a little too revolutionary in its fundamental idea. Like, it's about a resistance movement facing off against an authority, which is dope, but it's not the story that Partisan is at least not at the top. Beam Saber has gotten so good. I've been hanging out in the Discord. I've helped brainstorm some cool mechanics that I'd love to see everyone play with. I finally reached out to you and was like, hey, are you in a place where you'd be good with Beam Saber? And you were like, let me look at the classes again. And at that point, you'd only seen all of the main classes that are in the book currently. And then I linked you to one of the Patreon prototype classes, like the upcoming ones that'll be in a supplement that currently, if you support Austin Ramsey's Patreon, you can get access to 4 extra classes. I'm going to say 2 additional crews. I was thinking about this one, and your exact response was, oh yes, this is 100% correct, which previously there just hadn't, the thing you wanted to play just wasn't in the book. It just 100% wasn't in the book, and it would have been one of those things where we would have had to have forced it in a little bit,
Yeah. Where you start reading things a little more metaphorically in terms of moves and whatnot.
Exactly. Well, this is a soldier. That's sort of like this other thing. I get this person's strong, this person's smart. Okay, I guess you can do that. And I think the lesson for me there, for you, Riley, is to think less. And actually, what I actually think about a lot is Masks playbooks. The playbooks in Masks. All of y'all played Masks, right?
Yeah.
Where those books aren't about doing superpowers. Right? To your last point here, Riley, in a setting where there isn't magic or sci-fi, Masks has fantastic playbooks that are about interpersonal relationships, are about the identity, a character's identity and their vision of themselves, and about the way that the characters relate to the world and to other people. And that is so much broader than here is a person who can lift a car, And I feel like that is my favorite model, even though I also love it when Jack DeKeat takes the move that is do extra damage to a robot and then gets to say, do you know what the weakest point of a mech is? Or I like the Onomastic and the Cybertome, or I like the, all of those. I do like flavorful setting-filled, books, but I think a lot about how much... As a GM, it gave me so much joy to see all of you make Masks characters, because you were starting with, how does my character relate to themselves in the world? So yeah.
To be clear, the thing I was referring to was I think you came to me being like, oh, I thought this hackery one.
That was after. Then we were like, well,
okay.
we ended up having a conversation about the playbook we were talking about, and you were like, well, but it doesn't have anything that connects to this thing. And then I was like, well, what about this thing? And we went back and forth at that point, but it was mostly about figuring out how to tie in one other aspect of the character, which I guess to that point, Forged in the Dark games are super good at this, which is a character in Forged in the Dark games. And if you're running Forged in the Dark stuff at home, please, please, please remember this. If you choose a character type playbook in Forged in the Dark, the only thing you're really locked to is starting action score, starting your first ability, and then gear, and in the case of Beam Saber, vehicle gear. Everything else, I guess items or gear. I said that. Everything else is multi-class, right? You can start as a soldier in Beam Saber, and then take one move from soldier, and then every other upgrade that you take could come from infiltrator. But maybe you first want that soldier ability. That's the same thing with crews. So you could start with, if you're playing Blades in the Dark, you could start with the Hawker crew that sells stuff, and then decide actually we want to be Toughums, whatever the one is about fighting brawlers. I don't remember.
Strong Boys Gang?
It's the Strong Boys gang. You can decide you want to be in the Strong Boys gang, and immediately start taking stuff from Strong Boys gang. Also, man, I miss that video that doesn't exist on
video.
Yeah.
What you're talking about as well is also really good if you feel like your character is moving further away from that like broad picture, because sometimes you move further away from your initial very broad stroke of a character and you're like, hell yeah, this rules. And I got to do that a bunch with 14, where like 14 just transformed into a variety of different characters that I didn't think I was going to be playing. But sometimes you do want to be like, oh, I thought I was going to be doing more of this, and I really wanted to do that more, but that's not coming through.
Yeah.
And then you can start looking at other playbooks and be like, well, I want to do this a bit. Like, we did this a bunch with Lem, where we were like, what does Lem want to be doing more in combat? And can we look elsewhere to make that happen?
Yeah, totally.
The answer is war crimes.
That is what ended up happening with Lem. Whoops. Well, more just crimes against humanity. You weren't really at war.
I wasn't really at war.
Did we ever have a war? Did we ever have a Hyron war?
Did we ever have a war? I mean, Ordena is kind of at war.
Yeah, there was. You know what? That was the big war fight. The big war fight was the Twinbrook, Old Man's Chin stuff. That was a good war fight.
Definitely.
That was fun. Anyway,
just generally crimes.
I was like, we should do a season about war. I started to say before remembering that we're about to in some real way. So, nothing to stress over.
Multi-class stuff is great. I just realized as you were talking about that like I think some of the most iconic moves my characters have been taken from other classes. Like Bamboozle is a bard move that Adair took.
Oh wow, yeah, true.
Onomastic or not onomastic, the Doctor. I took a mystic move with Stitcher that let me do some of the onomastic stuff.
Totally.
Kind of when we switch that over. God. More multi-classing.
All right.
Thanks, Desk.
That's not a good answer to how do you make compelling playbooks is allow multi-classing. It's sort of the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Encourage it though. Okay, so here's a real thing. A thing that Beam Saber does, specifically talking about vehicles, because you mentioned the vehicles are one of the only are a thing where like it's kind of set what classes have what, but a thing that they encourage you to do when you are adding your vehicle's quirks is to look at the other classes, look at the other playbooks, look at their specific vehicle things, and if you see one that you like, take one and then add a negative modifier.
Yeah.
Like,
I love that rule so much.
Whatever, or like old blah, so that even lets you use, sort of multi-class in a more rigid sort of section of that book, which is good. Like, encourage that, build that in. That's very real stuff, because then people can really, the thing that to basically boil this down, we all make our individual character and then basically shape a playbook around, like we shape everything else around that. So the more you encourage that, the more people are going to be compelled by what you can offer in terms of those classes and playbooks and whatever.
And to go back to the first question from Jay briefly, actually, what you're hearing here is that I have 3 players on the call who love to have toy boxes and to tinker, to come up with ideas first, to have their like, here is who my character is, and then map something in the game to their idea. Riley, it is your job as the GM as the creator, to anticipate the fact that some tables will not be like that. Some tables will be the situation that Jack suggested earlier, which is like, we're all around a table. We've never played this before. I go, yeah, I read this once. Here are the playbooks. And I hand them out. And then you all flip through them and go, I'm going to do this one. I'll build this one because it has a cool move in it. And walking that line is definitely important, because especially if you're going to start playing this game at conventions, if you're going to be playing this, if you're going to expect people to play this for one-shots, the idea of like quickly being able to say, okay, I'm not going to I don't have time to build a huge long backstory or character. I don't know this world. I don't really know you as the GM. I'm just here to kind of like make a thing. That is a way to or a thing worth keeping in mind when it comes to especially the presentation of that information. It's one of the reasons why Forged in the Dark games do still have playbooks instead of not having them at all and just being a list of moves, is because it just helps the reader to start to conceptualize things in terms of like consistency and categorization, where it's like, okay, listen, the lurk does not have to be, you can pick the lurk and then immediately throw it away, but you might have a player who's like, this is my character, this is it, I'm playing the lurk, I'm going to check all of these boxes, I'm not going to look at another playbook, and that is 100% an acceptable way to play that game. And so while I definitely want to support everyone here who's been like multi-classing, kind of loose structure so that we can kind of fit like almost like classes as dress form instead of as dress, some people are going to want to put a dress on. Some people are going to want there to be enough to be like, I am playing the thief and that is who I'm playing. And it's a choice you'll have to make in terms of which way to err, because you will bias one way or the other for sure, but probably best practice to at least consider both of those perspectives while you're designing the game and formatting the game too. I'm going to advance. Eamon, or Eamon, or Iman, I actually don't know how to pronounce your name, I'm sorry. Apologies. I've been asked to join a few games recently as a player, and I'm really struggling with how much I should have of my character before going in. I find
Part two.
I find I either go into a game feeling like I'm ticking off a checklist for a character arc, or I'll end up trying something with little to no planning and end up getting bored of the character quickly. Since y'all are going into a new season, I thought it might be a good time to ask how you all personally go through creating a character. How do you know when you've got enough for a character? How do you keep track of who your character is and where they're going, and what does smart characterization look like? Ramble/rant shortened into a single question. How much of a character should you bring into your game before it starts?
Some.
Not a lot.
Today you don't know what the rest of your life is.
Damn, time about his quote of the day.
Like,
submit it,
like,
someone.
Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein. Today you don't know what the rest of your life is. No, I get you.
look, I'm like really guilty of overthinking stuff. I will have hours long playlists before a season even starts. That's why I have two playlists. I have the me playlist where I just put stuff, and then the playlist that I actually release on Twitter and say, "Here's my character playlist."
I'm going to
They're
open this.
completely different, and one of them is 6 times longer than the other one, and that's fine. But like when you're starting out a game, for me, a big part of it is like think as much as you want about who that character was before the game starts, and maybe about like what their goals are, because that's the information that character has when that game starts. Like that's their experience. If you start thinking, I mean, this is not going to work. In some games you need to think about like, well, what does this character want? What do I want this character to accomplish in terms of story and all that? But if you want to give yourself room to be enthusiastic about the character, but also have room to react more spontaneously to the story rather than feeling you're forcing things in there or checking off a list, I think that's my best advice, is to like think of who that character is before the story starts and like work on that stuff. But like don't I'm gonna like add to that saying like don't be like waiting for the moment for you to introduce the lost sibling of so and so who comes back and they have a fight or whatever, and like that's not necessarily what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I think that speaks to this question of like, Eamon says, I find I go in feeling like I'm ticking off a checklist for a character arc, and I think that's always less effective than going with a bunch of raw material. As the GM, I always appreciate it when I can see a bunch of potential arcs, especially when you're giving me enough like material to intersect your arcs with other character arcs. You know what I mean? Whereas, as a player, I've definitely done the thing of like, I'm ready to tell the story of this character. And are there other characters in the party? Who knows? I don't know. I don't care. I'm going to tell my story, and I hope the GM pays attention to me and does that. And that's like I get where that comes from, me playing lots of video games when I was first starting to play role-playing, like tabletop role-playing games, and thinking of characters in that way. And I don't just mean in terms of like being the protagonist, but thinking about like the BioWare character, where it's like, well, this character is going to have their arc, and it's going to be situated over here, away from all the other characters. Like, Cassandra is going to have her thing, and yes, she'll be in the party when the main plot happens, but her thing is over here, separate from, another... why have I blanked on all the characters? Blackwall? Why do they go to Blackwall next? Anyway, you get what I'm saying. Whereas, in fact, the best version of this is, hey, everyone gets to pour all their stuff in the middle of the pile, and you can immediately start building connections together. It's why I think it's why I always want to do a session 0 with everyone before we kind of hit play on the game, so to speak, so that we can talk about connections between characters and so that we can kind of finalize those bigger ideas together. It's why I also like systems that mechanize relationships. I'm never going to be over the first step of Tech Noir, where you have a list of NPCs and you build connections with them, because you end up with this great linking chain of characters who multiple people might end up connected to the same character in different ways, and that creates relationships then innately between the characters who share those relations. If you go back to the beginning of Counterweight, like, we switched off of Tech Noir, but that fundamental first step of like, here are the player characters and they've linked up with these NPCs, carried so much of the season forward in terms of relationships that were important and being the building block of what would come. And that stuff only happens because we take the step at the beginning of the game together to talk about characterization and relationships. That doesn't happen if you're like only in a corner writing your own story for yourself, if that makes sense. Jack and Art, I'm curious as we go into the season, where I think yours are the only characters who have established relationships, or relations to each other. Is kind of an interesting thing there. Where like,
yeah,
I'm curious what you think about this.
I like either having very broad statements, like very, very broad statements, like this character is this age, or like this character wants this thing, or really vague questions. Like, I definitely feel the tendency of wanting a checklist for a character arc, almost specifically kind of like wanting so badly to find an arc that I have to resist the temptation to plot that out earlier, because like Austin said, the best way, and kind of the way that I think our medium finds those arcs best, is through messy entanglements at the table, and through relationships, and through surprise answers to questions.
Yeah.
So I wonder if the closest I get to a checklist is I write a bunch of questions that I am interested in thinking about and talking about, and I try very hard not to write answers to them, and I try and make the questions big enough that I just straight up can't write the answer to them, because if I tried to write the answer now, it would always be like TK, 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 or just I do not have enough information to answer this. And so I think for me, it's definitely like big broad statements. She wears white. Okay, cool, right? We know we have a character that wears white. She's this age or whatever. Or questions like, how does this character respond when being threatened? Not in terms of specific lines, but just like, what is the posture that this character would take? And it might be that we find that the answer is not what we were expecting.
Yeah.
But I find that questions like that can help guide me over a season in terms of like, what do I want to be thinking about as I play this character?
Yeah.
Whereas I have like a more cynical answer to this. Ooh. Whereas like Jack pitched me their character, and I was like, "That's great. I'm gonna have a character that can just interact with this character as much as I want."
You've just built like a parasite. You've just decided, or a symbiote. Like, all right, I can build off that. I can live off of your aura. No, I'm super excited.
And you know, there's a good history with this interplayer relationship, and so I know that we can bring it when we need to bring it. And I think I crafted a character that does
Yes.
stand alone. But like, it was just like, I am going. That's a very shiny object, and I would like to be close to the shiny object. Especially when no one else had anything at that moment. It was everything else was just dark.
There's an extent to which there's so much about our relationship that is just completely dark. At least to me, and you haven't told me.
Yeah, it's very funny to have the bird's eye view here, and know more, not like secrets.
You have the hidden information game.
You've
had your eyes open during the round of werewolf.
You understand that there was a moment during character creation, during the phase of which I was like, hey, let's talk about character ideas with every player, for Partisan, where it was like, people were pitching me stuff here and there, and there was one day specifically where Allie was like, I can't believe Jack and Art. I'm not throwing you under the bus here, Allie. I love you because the end of the story is that you rule. You were like, Allie was like, I can't believe Jack and Art already have finished characters. I was like, well, I can see why you would think that. And then within a day or 2 days, Allie was like the first one to have a character sheet, or like the like a complete history of the. I was like, all right, see, like here it is. This is, now we're good. Now we're in it. But I guess for that matter, to Eamon's point, I will say I have been at the table when I like show up and like, I'm going to play, let me see here. I'll be Ranger. And then someone else sits down at the table and is like, my name is Thurgod, the barbarian. And here are my conquest number 1. And I'm like, well, I have a dog. So, who won, bro? It was me. I got a dog.
But there's an extent to which, like, it is so wild in play, and we've seen this in the show, where a character has, in the moment, ad-libbed a bunch of past conquests.
Yes.
And,
totally.
like, to an extent, obviously there's different games and different setups, so I'm, like, reluctant to say this is the better option. But to an extent, I feel so much more excited about tabletop games when one character on the fly discovers a bunch of past conquests.
Oh, yeah, totally. For me, like, the real thing I wanted to get at there was, this is also one of those things that's worth talking about as a group, that is like, hey, how prepped do we want to be here? Like, we do have prep for Partisan characters at this point, but we actually don't have as much as we did for Twilight Mirage characters in some ways. Like, I feel like there's a degree to which I want Partisan Episode 0 to feel more like Marielda Episode 3 or Dungeon World Episode 1, where it's like, here's who they are, here's what they want. I mean, more than Dungeon World, right? Dungeon World was so raw. So much was just like, yeah, I think I'm this. And I don't know that we can ever capture that again outside of live at the table games, because we have to think about things so much more, and prep for seasons takes so much longer. And even in my wildest dreams at this point, there is such a pressure that, like, I can't imagine being like, we don't know what we're going to do next. And then in 1 week, the way I decided we should do Dungeon World, and then the next week we do it. And I cannot imagine us living in that world again. But Marielda was like a really great happy medium between that and like Twilight Mirage, where it's like, all right, here are my character ideas. Here are some things that I want to find a map. I think I run a blacksmith shop secretly. I'm making a boat. Like, that's okay, cool. That's enough, And Partisan has the drive system, which is a very cool way to start conceptualizing arcs and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, or Beam Saber, not Partisan, Beam Saber. So yeah, someone in the, Morgan in the chat says, we're sisters. That's right, folks. Jack and Art are playing Yuki and Tiffy. They're BFF characters, but in mechs.
First crossover.
Finally. Did you know the BFF? If you zoomed out from BFF, what you would realize is it takes place on the same planet as the Echo game we did.
It's deeply, deeply cursed. God.
Anything else here
this
before
is a
we...
joke. We're not.
It's not
playing Yuki and Tiffy.
That is not happening. Next question?
No, there's really not enough time to go back to that.
No, I wish. Ready for the next one?
Let's do it.
Yeah. This one coming from Adam, and Adam asks, how do you use NPCs in a way that still gives them stuff to do so that they aren't just useless things with names that the PCs banter with, while also allowing the PCs to be the protagonists? In the game I'm running most often, Masks: A New Generation, there is a principle that reads, make adults seem childish and short-sighted, which exasperates the issue. Well, I know this doesn't literally mean make the adults incompetent. It is what can easily happen. But in general, I super don't know how to make NPCs have a purpose in the story. If y'all could provide any tips, that would be wonderful. And related, any tips on how to give NPC a character arc would also be appreciated. Thanks in advance. So the first thing for me is, like, if you look at Masks, it has a bunch of principles, and those principles aren't meant to be taken, like, word for word universally. The make adults seem childish and short-sighted one is, in fact, a corrective meant to ensure that you as the GM don't produce adult characters who seem perfectly reasonable and logical, which when you're making games starring children and teens is something that I think the game creators expected might happen. If you don't have that issue, if your adult characterization is not by default kind of cold and rational, then you probably are already doing what this rule is meant to intend for you to do, which is to make them complex and have them make mistakes and have them have, prejudices and have them have, bad ideas and get into trouble. It does not necessarily mean doesn't mean make them incompetent. It doesn't mean keep them from having goals or keep them from having motivations. It means that they maybe don't know how to act on those motivations or achieve those goals in the way that, like, a perfect soldier or robot, or this idea of, like, I'm single-minded, I'm gonna get the thing done, I'm like gonna hit my target no matter what. They're gonna get distracted, they're gonna have conflicted emotions, etc. And for me, that ends up being the kind of containing the key answer to this, which is, like, the way you make NPCs that have stuff to do is to give them things they want. Just about every major NPC I do, I at least at some point, and I mean major, like, I don't mean there's a guard at the edge of the road, or at the edge of town that they're going to talk to. But anytime I'm like, this is going to be an NPC that I suspect players are going to really spend time with, I sit down and I think, and I ideally take a quick note that is just like, what do they want? What's the thing that they are working towards, either day in, day out, or on their off time? What's the dream that they have? It can be as simple as to get rich. It can be as broad as to reform the system of citizenship in this nation. And somewhere in between, or on the way to those things, you end up making them be characters who do things on their own and who find their way into action instead of just being backdrop. The second way to do it is to rely on them as things that, as agents whose actions intersect with the player characters. So, like, you don't necessarily have a person who necessarily opposes the player characters, because maybe they're not a villain in your Masks game, but they might have something that like gets them into trouble in a similar way. We just recorded another game for Bluff City, in which the characters met an NPC who was in the area under her own, motivation, doing her own shit, getting into trouble, and ended up being able to be, like, a little bit of, like, the fire under the player characters' asses, but also a pressure for them to respond to and react against. And that ended up being, like, really helpful for specific reasons I won't get into because it'd be spoilers. But yeah, I think that's the big one for me. Is, like, identify what they want, and then identify what is their capacity for pursuing what they want. If they're an admiral in the Navy, they're going to have different ways to pursue what they want than if they're, like, a stay-at-home dad, but figuring out what they want and then, like, what is available to them for how to get there is definitely, like, the first biggest step for giving them action, giving them purpose in the story, which is to say narrative connection to the story, and making their purposes or making their motivations and action connect to where the camera is harder work. But for me, it begins and ends with, like, getting them entangled with the player characters. And if you can do that, and you can see in the ways in which their motivations intersect with the player character motivations, their goals begin to either conflict or align. Suddenly, you'll have characters who move in and out of your story that have weight and have like presence instead of just being cardboard cutouts who give the NPC or who give the player characters quests. You know. I'm curious if anyone else at the table who's run a game or who's played the game been like, oh, this is what makes a good NPC.
There's an extent to which you're definitely feeding off. You mentioned it earlier, like an NPC that you have sold to us.
Yeah, totally.
Where you're like, this character, the players are going to like this NPC, or even when it happens accidentally, and we all are like, you know what? This person, this stranger, we're really into, and you're like scrambling to be like, oh, geez, okay, this character. I can't remember if Primo was one you under or overestimated our involvement with.
Probably under. Primo was a few sketches, but I did have motivation for him. I did know who he was loyal to, what he wanted to do with the world. But he was not meant to be a big one. And then everyone loved him.
And then we were like, Primo rules.
Yeah.
And that is like an incredible sign from your players.
Yeah.
And also can help guide your character work. Because your players will want things from these characters outside of just interaction with the plot. Like, you know, if you've set these characters up with interesting motivations and entanglements, as Austin was describing, players should be interested in this character's interiority to a certain extent, and they will ask questions that you might not have answers to, and in finding those answers, you will have the character act more realistically than just showing up to give a plot beat or whatever. Like, players will, through their involvement with your characters, prompt you to make decisions about those characters that should help flesh them out.
Yeah.
What's this character's deal? Can be expressed in a whole bunch of ways.
Totally. Yeah. I also don't want to undersell that part of making a good NPC can be like, not a good NPC, but a useful NPC, an NPC that has stuff to do, can be arrived at from the opposite direction, which is not, I have an idea for someone with motivations and like, the ability to pursue those motivations. You can arrive at a useful NPC or an NPC that ends up doing stuff by having a sort of narrative structure goal, which can be, I need an NPC to light a fire under the NPC, or under the player character's asses. I need an NPC who... Ebex. Right. Yeah, 100% Ebex, right? Ebex in Kingdom, obviously Ebex starts as a tiny side character in, what do you call it? In the Kingdom, or not the Kingdom, the Stars Without Number part of Counterweight. And the Kingdom game was always going to be about him to some degree, but the degree to which he became an on-screen important character was, and the way that he rocked the boat in the Kingdom game of Counterweight was fundamentally about a need I saw at the table to generate outcomes and to push the player characters into conflict versus, hey, here's a person who has a specific motivation. His motivations and what he had available to him came from my need to make sure not everyone constantly agreed their way through Kingdom. And I think the same thing is true if you look at a number of other major characters who have shown up across all the seasons. Like Aurel exists the way Aurel does for completely metatextual reasons that have to do with a player leaving the game, that have to do with like me wanting there to be an echo of Samathes and Samat with or a certain relationship, and like kind of my interest in generational and cyclical like tragedy exists because I wanted there to be a character who pushed Hadrian to make certain choices. Like that stuff, all like who the character is comes together organically around that narrative purpose. You don't have to think about these characters. You don't have to start with interiority. You can arrive at interiority. Interiority is important. Interiority and capability is how you arm them and make them do stuff. But you can decide, like, I need someone who challenges their commitment to justice, or I need someone who challenges their commitment to nonviolence or whatever, and then build from that, that is how storytellers work too. That's not just a game thing. That is how, like, sometimes you're writing a story and you go, "Oh fuck, I really need someone who would make Batman make a rash decision instead of making a thoughtful one." You know, because I want to tell a story about Batman making a bad call. You know, whatever. Anyway, any other thoughts here on NPCs? I think we have one more question after this. Janine.
Yeah, I think an important thing to consider here is that player characters don't have a purpose in the story just because they're player characters. Like there's like as I go through this question, like allowing the PCs to be protagonists, make NPCs have purpose in the story. Like there are things that sort of leap out to me in terms of like a character is to some extent a character. It's just some of them are not being controlled by you as the GM, and some of them get more camera time. But like the thing that makes a player character interesting in the story is the thing that makes an NPC interesting in the story, which is reacting to things that are happening and being a part of things that are happening. And if those characters like are in place to respond in interesting ways, it'll come together. Like if a player character does nothing and never responds to anything, they are also not, they have no purpose
Right.
in the story, you know?
Right, yeah.
Like if they're just there, it's the same thing. The other thing I would say is that like in terms of getting hung up on make adults seem childish and short-sighted as a thing, kind of echoing what was said earlier, like that doesn't mean that they just have to be contrarian. Like
Right.
if the game is setting them up as sort of like they want the team and everyone else to have a kind of sort of adversarial relationship, there are a lot of ways to portray that. We never saw when we played Mask. We never saw Shanti's mother on screen, but I think an example of this would be Shanti's mother, who knew about her powers, believing that her daughter should be an ornithologist because Shanti could talk to birds. If for people who haven't heard Mask. So her mother was like, "Oh well, you can talk to birds. You should go to school and learn about and like become a bird scientist." And Shanti was like, "Well, that's an incredibly terrible idea because I can talk to birds. So if we're super wrong about birds, how do I explain how I know all this based on talking to birds? Like it doesn't realistically bear out. And like that's not her mom being incompetent. That's her mom expressing the fact that like she doesn't understand this experience.
Right.
She's outside of it. Her ideas about it are not super relevant. She's not being antagonistic or foolish or whatever, or incompetent. It's just, and that's something that says something about both Shanti and her mom.
Right. And then from there, you can take that disconnect and extend it into action. We haven't played more Masks, but like as you were talking, I was generating ideas like how would I then use that relationship to put pressure on Shanti to have to make decisions. So it's like, what happens the day that Shanti comes home and her mom says, "Guess what? I got you into the ornithology department at Harvard. Like, I know you said you didn't want to go, but I submitted an application. I printed out one of your essays that you were really proud of, and like." Okay.
They sent you a bird scholarship.
Right, they sent you a bird
school.
scholarship to bird school. That's exactly what it is. Exactly. And it's like, well, fuck. Well, now you have to take action in response to that. And that is not action. It's definitely action. And it is childish and short-sighted, but it's not like incompetence, and it's not non-action. It's not like, well, that means they can't change the world, you know? So yeah. That would be really fun and terrible. Can't wait to one day revisit those characters.
I'm excited to find out what wrong about birds looks like.
I have a new player character, and the only trait I'm bringing to the table is wrong about birds. What's that mean? Well, let's find out together. I'll start with this. Doesn't know the difference between a crow and a flamingo. Really wrong about birds.
Whoa, that's pretty wrong.
I know.
I'm interested in hearing about this character, though.
Yeah, I'll bring him in. I'll figure it out. This is the seed of a character. All right.
How did that even happen?
I don't have an answer. I'll figure it out. See, now you've given me a question. I'll go back into prep and we'll figure it out. All right. Last one comes in from Matthew, who says, "In my current campaign, I have a player who the end of every session, voices an anxiety that they haven't been playing their character well. I'm the GM, and as far as I can tell, they're doing fine as I understand the character. I've already suggested listing character goals and guiding principles at the top of their sheet, which they did. However, the anxiety and the voicing of that anxiety continues. Is there anything you can think of that I could do to help? Again, as far as I can tell, they're doing a fine job role-playing the character, but their anxiety is genuine. I'm curious. I think
you could just at me next time. I mean, we don't have to do this like this.
You do fine, Art. You do great. I don't know why you always.
I know, but I frequently end recording sessions like, "Oh, I fucked that up. I've ruined the
Same. I
season,
think a
the
lot of
session,
That's
the
all of
podcast.
us,
We're all
yeah.
going to be broke in the
Yeah.
gutter."
I have a tweet about this.
You do. You do. It's a good tweet.
Maybe I think the thing, like I was the one who flagged this, and the thing is a thing that we should probably answer. And I think what might be interesting is like if we talked about what makes us, like what is the source of us at the end saying I don't feel good about that. Like for me, for example, it is often that I feel like I missed an opportunity, like either to be useful or for characterization. If I feel like I didn't like 100% get all of those, and like pick up everything that was being put down, that's what makes me feel like I fucked up a session. So, the sessions that I leave feeling best about are ones where I feel like I really did something with my character and that I really understood everything that was happening and that I really contributed to everyone else's stories as much as my own. That statement's weird. That's kind of contradictory to stuff we don't really say. You know what I mean? In terms of like, it feels like I, was part of what was going on and not just locked into my own path of it, or my own section of it. And when I feel bad, it's because I feel like I just didn't do any of that.
Yeah. Do you have techniques for addressing that now that you know that is one of the kind of triggers of the anxiety?
Not really, because a lot of it for me is I have a hard time, like, I lose track of the big picture a lot, I think, both in terms of like what my character's goals are. Like I think I usually have their tone and their responses and stuff down, but in terms of like what their alignment is and all this, I have to remind myself of that actively a lot. And so there's a lot of stuff where it just kind of feels like sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I follow things well and sometimes I get extremely lost. But I think, I think part of it is just being able to recognize if that's the problem with this anxious player and like being able to, I don't know, it's easier in terms of if it's an issue with they don't feel like they're contributing or they don't feel like they're doing what their character should be doing, because you can kind of help with that a little more versus if you feel if their problem is that they aren't following the like intricacies. That's harder to help with.
Yeah, for me that is like, if you know that is one of the things causing the anxiety, slow down, do more summaries, which is the thing we started doing in the middle of Twilight Mirage, where it was like, all right, before we go further, here is everything that just happened. Let's try to break down so that we're all on the same page. What was the big picture of that last sequence? Where is everyone at now? What are they working on? Definitely helped. I hope. Art, you just voiced that you definitely finish every session feeling this way.
Not every session, but certainly many. Certainly everyone where I've ever made like a big choice.
Sure. Why is it that those sessions that trigger it, and then like, have you found some way of addressing that, or what has helped you address that anxiety?
One thing that I think what causes the anxiety is this idea that like I've made a big choice and it's like it's wrecking the game for you or for other players, that I'm like, well, we're just gonna do what I want to do, and I'm just like pulling the wheel too hard. And it usually helps that no one ever voices that opinion to me, which I feel like they at this point certainly they would.
Yeah, 5 years in, one
I
of
was
us.
gonna say I've never, ever, ever,
No,
ever
me
once
either.
felt that, or it's never even occurred to me partially.
And then there's like general performance anxiety, like, oh well, that was bad work and everyone will hate it. And what's helped with that is generally people don't. Um, the positive response to Late Twilight Mirage helped a lot because that was when I thought I was most just like off on an island setting things on fire by myself, and then like people generally responded positively to it.
They were like, yeah, Grand Magnificent's off on an island setting things to fire by himself, but he's doing
this
it really
works.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of it's never going to go away just because that's what like performance is like.
Yeah.
You step off the stage feeling shitty about what you just did, even if you got a standing ovation, and you probably it's the same. Everything I've ever written that I've had to reread has been like, oh, what idiot wrote this? And that's only for a little while, right? And then 6 months later, you're like, I was a genius then, and now I'm bad.
Yeah, this is the worst.
This is bad. Back then, I was brilliant. And I think it's just like you just have to let all of that go because it's just a bad part of your brain talking to you.
Jack,
Yeah,
I'm curious about you. Yeah, go ahead.
I absolutely feel this. It's been actually. So this is part of an answer. Is like, it's been really heartening hearing Janine and Art talk about these anxieties as well. Because I'm like, oh wow, I'm not the only person on Earth who is feeling this. Specifically about ending a recording and just going like, wow, damn, friends at the table, it's over. Screwed it up. But I think for me as well, and again, like this is speaking to my own anxiety, so I'm not sure to what extent it is helpful, but for me at least it kind of comes it's like in seasons, not linked to the show, but like I definitely have memories of working on Friends at the Table and being both substantially less and substantially more anxious than I am at any given moment. Like I remember, certain periods of certain seasons I remember being really very difficult. And I came away from them feeling like I wasn't doing what I wanted, or I wasn't picking up what people were putting down, or I was pulling the wheel too hard, or I performed badly. And then there are definitely bits of seasons where I felt good about what I was playing with and what I was working on. And I think part of the way that tabletop is structured, where you sit down with a group of people, semi regularly and work on a continued story, means that there are definitely going to be days where, and I'm not saying this in the sense where I'm like, oh, don't worry, it'll pass, so much as the way the anxiety feels and the way that it lands and the way that I try and address it in myself varies depending on what I'm working on. Rather than it being the case where I'm just like, either I feel great all the time, or I get to the end of I can comfort myself by saying, well, hopefully I won't feel like this in 5 or 6 months.
Yeah. Almost referenced something from the end of Evangelion, which I will not do. But if you go listen to the Waypoint episodes on Evangelion, I make a note about the depiction of anxiety and depression in the final episode of the regular show that speaks to the exact thing Jack just said, because of how true it felt to me in terms of that feeling of like, well, right now I feel like shit, but there's the possibility that tomorrow or 3 months from now I will not.
Like no feeling is final.
Right. Well, that is it, right?
Says a lot.
And I think that is my advice to you as a GM, Matthew, is to make sure that when you have those conversations with the player, that there does not feel like there's pressure on them to hide or negate that anxiety, because that can just redouble it. The thing is that like playing games with other people can be an anxiety-inducing thing, and because anxiety and mental health in general is, like you said, Jack, ongoing. It's not there's no final state. It's a process. It's an ongoing process. You can have someone who has an anxious reaction and who can have who can process that on their own time, But if you pressure them to like resolve it, that would be the thing that I feel like would be like very risky and increase the degree of anxiety. I know as a GM for me with y'all, like I expect that when I do expect every season for there to be kind of high anxiety moments, and as you say you do here, Matthew, you do check-ins with them. You with your player, you make sure to like give them tips about how to prioritize the stuff that you think or that they've told you can be anxiety-inducing for them, and how to address it. It sounds like you're doing that stuff well already, and to some degree, while it is your job to check in on them as a GM and as a collaborator, what it is not your job to do is to like be demanding that they fit their response to your comfort, if that makes sense. And I'm not saying you're doing that, but I'm just as a corrective, as a potential corrective to anyone listening who is like, well, am I doing enough? Am I doing enough? Am I doing enough? And I'm only saying that because we've already had so many episodes where I've explained that, like, you know, how important the conversation Allie and I had after the hella, you know, evil conversation in the game happened, how important it was to talk to Janine, you know, after the early Veil arc where there was such a big disconnect that caused lots of anxiety. Like, we should have those conversations. Those conversations are so important, but also you have not been, no one has come to you and said, and now you're my therapist, help me work out this anxiety. And also if they did, it is within your right to be like, I'm happy to be your friend. I am not a trained therapist. I don't want to give you bad advice, etc. So like there is a degree to which I think recognizing the limits of what that relationship is an important part of that process, and recognizing that like anxiety is a thing that happens as part of these games, and that isn't a personal failure on you as the GM necessarily, especially if you're already taking these good steps that you've outlined here. And it's not a failure on the person who feels anxious. You know, that is a thing that happens. Like, I can't imagine playing something like the Patina, the Feast of Patina, and not feeling anxious afterwards. You know what I mean? I'm happy we did it.
Tabletop session.
But like, I'm so happy we did it. But also, I don't know that I could move for a day. You know?
No.
So.
Aren't I? That ended out in my friendship.
Was that it?
Yeah.
That was the end.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that why Art is now fluttering around your season 6 character like a moth?
Oh god.
I tease. I think that's all I have on this stuff. Matthew is in the chat actually, and adds, this was a while ago. We ended the campaign last week with a big finale that included this player having us go back and rewrite a scene after a break to better reflect their character. That's awesome. So, I hit the microphone, sorry. And that definitely speaks to what we were talking about before, about like nothing is permanent in these games. Like character comfort, player comfort should definitely take priority. So yeah. God, is there anything else on this one?
And we re-recorded a scene from the end of the spring finale because I thought I did a bad job of that, and it was the right call.
It was the right call. We absolutely did that, and it was the right call, and it was because you were not happy with it. So, like, yeah, do it. I mean, you know, we recorded the first episode of Twilight Mirage twice, so, like, you got to be willing to take your player comfort.
There's precedent here.
There is precedent, yeah, absolutely, and like, that is player comfort, finding the right tone for your game, being able to talk at that meta level. Like that, for me, like the number one thing that has helped me as a GM is being able to talk as a storyteller, but also as a collaborator and as like a showrunner, but also as like a person in the room who is an organizer. And so like being able to not just say, hey, did you like how the story went? But also, hey, is the system working? Is like, hey, I noticed that you know, we had a lot of failures in a row, and that was a fucking bummer. Is there some way we can talk about how to revise your character sheet, or is there like a situation that hasn't come up that would be exciting? You know, stuff like that ends up being so important because it isn't just when I was a GM in college. Like the only thing I talked about not off mic, but like away from the table was like, what do you want to do when you level up, and do you have a good idea for a scene in the next episode, or the next, you know, not recording session, not episode, the next like tabletop session, and that was it. Like there was very little hey, did you feel like you got enough time, to show off that session? Do you feel like I put too much on you? And again, like I'm not advising that you batter your players with questions, but if you're paying attention, you can tell, or I've been able to tell when like, ooh, someone is not having fun in this moment. How do I either adjust going forward or talk to them about how to best adjust going forward, or get confirmation that the thing I'm reading is actually a real thing versus me being anxious, because GM anxiety is also very much a real thing. So yeah. If there's nothing else, we can end the show. Remember, you can send your questions to tipsathetable@gmail.com. We are now caught up on Tips at the Table, so the next one will be in November. I know that November starts in 3 days, but, we're currently in the process of catching up on all of our Patreon stuff. There will be bluffs coming out pretty rapidly over the next few months, next couple of months at least.
We should have 3 months of log, right? At this point?
We're putting them out more quickly than that.
Oh, well then.
Because we're so far back on them that we're trying to catch up. So people should look forward to more Bluff City very soon. We have two full arcs recorded at this point. I think each of them is going to end up being 3 episodes each instead of the normal 2 because they went long. So you have a lot of episodes of Bluff coming. And then we'll do another live sometime soon to continue to try to catch up on those. I'll have one more Drawing Maps episode, at least part of this pre-partisan stuff. And that should be either this weekend or next weekend. Are there any other things en route? I don't think for sure. So I'm going to not make any promises. I hope everyone has a great night. If you wanted to change your support level, or you want to check out some of the stuff we talked about in terms of being